Snow falls hard on a small frontier town. A church bell tolls. Townsfolk whisper as a rugged man steps from the shadows, his eyes locked on a trembling girl shivering on the church steps. She's the preacher's crippled niece, the one everyone's called worthless. But when he says those words, "I'm claiming you tonight," the street goes silent. They think he's gone mad. But he's not taking her for himself. He's saving her life. Up in the mountains, a secret burns beneath the snow. A letter that could steal his land, a past soaked in blood, and a truth that could ruin them both. As the railroad men close in and the preacher hides his own sin, their faith and love become the only light left in the storm. Can two broken souls, cast out by the world, find grace before the truth destroys them? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Snow drifted in lazy spirals as Nolan Brand's wagon creaked through the deepening twilight of Calico Ridge. The cold mountain air carried whispers and gasps from the townsfolk who had gathered to witness his shocking declaration. Mercy Tilden sat rigid beside him on the wagon seat, her thin shoulders trembling beneath her threadbare shawl. Nolan kept his eyes fixed ahead, guiding his team of horses through the rutted street with steady hands. The leather reins felt familiar and grounding against his calloused palms. His breath came out in white puffs as he wrestled with the weight of what he'd just done. After years of choosing solitude, of carrying his burden of guilt alone in his mountain cabin, he'd just upended both their lives with a few gruff words. Mercy's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. She hadn't spoken a word since he'd helped her onto the wagon, though he could feel the tremors running through her slight frame. The crude taunts of the miners still echoed in his mind, along with their callous plans to ship her off to an asylum like unwanted freight. The sheriff's office lay ahead, a squat building with yellow lamplight spilling from its windows. Nolan pulled the wagon to a halt, the horses stamping restlessly in the thickening snow. He turned slightly toward Mercy, careful to keep his movements slow and deliberate. "Miss Tilden," he said softly, his deep voice barely carrying above the whisper of falling snow. "I know this ain't what you expected, and I ain't asking anything improper, but I won't stand by and watch them send you away to that asylum." Mercy's fingers twisted in the folds of her skirt. "Why?" she whispered, her voice tremulous. "Why would you help someone like me?" The question struck him like a physical blow. Someone like her. He knew what she meant. The town's whispers about her twisted leg, the way they treated her as something broken and burdensome. It stirred something fierce in his chest, a protective anger he hadn't felt in years. "Because every soul has worth," he said firmly, echoing words he'd once heard from an old preacher before the war had stripped away his faith. "And anyone who says different ain't fit to judge." Tears spilled silently down Mercy's cheeks, catching the lamplight like tiny diamonds. "But you don't even know me, Mr. Brand." "I know enough," he replied. "I've watched you tend them flowers round the church all summer, even when your leg was paining you something fierce. Seen you reading to them children after Sunday service, making them laugh with different voices for each character." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "A person's worth ain't in their legs, Miss Tilden. It's in their heart." A small sob escaped her, quickly stifled behind her hand. Nolan waited patiently, understanding her fear. He was a stranger to her, really, the rough mountain man who came to town only when supplies ran low, trading furs and keeping to himself. But he'd noticed her quiet dignity in the face of the town's cruelty, had seen how she carried herself with grace despite their judgment. What happens now?" she asked hesitantly. "Now we see Sheriff Matthews," Nolan explained, keeping his voice steady and reassuring. "Get things proper and legal-like. Then, if you're willing, we head up to my cabin. It ain't much, but it's warm and solid, with a good view of the valley." He saw the flicker of uncertainty cross her face. "I wouldn't never harm you, Miss Tilden. You'd have your own room, with a lock on the door. I can fix up the old parlor right nice for you. Already got some ideas about making it easier for you to move around." The depth of thought he'd already given to her comfort seemed to surprise her. Mercy dabbed at her eyes with her sleeve, then straightened her shoulders with quiet determination. "You're very kind, Mr. Brand. But why would you want to saddle yourself with—" "Don't," he cut in, gentler than the word suggested. "Don't say what they've been saying about you. Ain't true and never was." A commotion from the saloon drew their attention. Through the swirling snow, they could see several miners stumbling out onto the boardwalk, their angry voices carrying clearly through the cold air. "Brand's gone soft in the head. Ain't right. Him taking advantage of the preacher's simple niece? Someone ought to stop this foolishness." Nolan's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm for Mercy's sake. "Pay them no mind, Miss Tilden. Ain't nothing but wind and empty barrels." She managed a tremulous smile at that, the first he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, bringing a hint of color to her pale cheeks. "You have a way with words, Mr. Brand, for a man who speaks so little." "Reckon some things are worth speaking up for," he replied, surprised by the warmth that simple smile kindled in his chest. The sheriff's office door opened, spilling more golden light into the snowy street. Sheriff Matthews stood in the doorway, his weathered face serious as he took in the scene before him. He was a fair man, Nolan knew, one of the few in town who had never treated Mercy with anything but courtesy. "Evening, Brand," the sheriff called out. "Miss Tilden, might want to step inside before this snow gets any deeper." Nolan climbed down from the wagon, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. He moved around to Mercy's side, offering his arms to help her down. She hesitated only a moment before accepting his assistance, her movements careful and practiced as she managed her weak leg. He could feel how light she was, how the years of hardship had worn her down to bird-like delicacy. Yet there was strength in her grip, determination in the set of her chin as she found her footing. Together they made their way to the sheriff's office, their progress slow but steady. Nolan matched his pace to hers without comment, offering his arm for support when needed, but never pressing closer than she allowed. Behind them, the miners' muttering grew louder, but Sheriff Matthews' steady gaze kept them from approaching. The office was warm, heated by a pot-bellied stove that glowed cherry red in the corner. The familiar scents of coffee, leather, and wood smoke filled the air. Sheriff Matthews closed the door firmly behind them, shutting out the cold and the hostile voices. "Now then," the sheriff said, settling behind his desk. "Suppose you folks want to tell me what this is all about." Mercy started to speak, but her voice failed her. Nolan stepped slightly forward, his presence solid and reassuring beside her. "I'm claiming Miss Tilden as my wife, Sheriff. Legal and proper, with witnesses and whatever papers need signing." The sheriff's bushy eyebrows rose. "That so?" He turned his kind eyes to Mercy. "This what you want, Miss Tilden? Nobody's forcing you into anything?" "No, sir," she managed, her voice gaining strength. "Mr. Brand he's trying to help me. They're planning to send me to the asylum in Denver. My uncle—" She faltered, pain crossing her features. "Her uncle's washing his hands of her," Nolan finished, unable to keep the edge of anger from his voice. "Calling her a burden on the church's charity, but she ain't that, never was. She's a good woman who deserves better than what this town's given her." Sheriff Matthews leaned back in his chair, studying them both thoughtfully. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the weight of the moment. Outside, the snow continued to fall, muffling the world in white silence. "Marriage is serious business," the sheriff said finally. Ain't something to enter into just to solve a problem." "No, sir, it ain't," Nolan agreed. "But I've got a good home, if simple. Can provide for a wife, treat her right. Miss Tilden deserves the chance to live free and dignified, not locked away like she's done something wrong." Mercy looked up at him then, something like wonder in her tear-bright eyes. Perhaps she was truly seeing him for the first time, not just the rough exterior and silent manner, but the depth of conviction in his words, the gentle strength in his weathered face. The sheriff nodded slowly. "Well, can't legally marry you folks tonight. Need to post the banns proper, get the paperwork in order, but I can witness your intent to marry and write up a temporary guardianship. That'll keep anyone from shipping Miss Tilden off anywhere against her will." Relief washed over Mercy's face, though she tried to hide it. "Thank you, Sheriff Matthews." "Don't thank me yet," the sheriff warned kindly. "Town's going to talk something fierce about this. Sure you're ready for that, both of you?" Nolan's expression hardened. "Let them talk. Ain't their business what happens between me and Miss Tilden." "Very well." The sheriff pulled out several sheets of paper and his good pen. "Miss Tilden, I'll need to speak with you privately first. Make sure this is truly your choice. Brand, wait outside a spell." Nolan touched the brim of his hat respectfully. "Yes, sir." He turned to Mercy, his voice softening. "I'll be right outside if you need me." She nodded, managing another small smile that seemed to light something warm in her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Brand, for everything." He stepped out onto the sheriff's porch, closing the door quietly behind him. The snow was falling harder now, but he barely felt the cold. His mind was full of that smile, of the way it had transformed her face from something wounded into something wonderful. Whatever came next, he knew he'd made the right choice. Sometimes a man had to stand up and do what was right, no matter what others might say. The light from the sheriff's window spilled out onto the snow-covered street, and Nolan Brand stood guard in the gathering storm, ready to defend this fragile new beginning with everything he had. The sheriff's office fell silent as Nolan Brand reached into his coat, producing a leather folder that bore the county clerk's official stamp. With deliberate care, he laid the papers on Sheriff Matthews' desk, smoothing them flat with one weathered hand. The golden glow of the oil lamp caught the fresh ink, still barely dry from that afternoon's signing. Mercy leaned forward in her chair, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap, as she tried to make sense of the official document before her. Her eyes widened as she read the carefully penned words. Certificate of Legal Wardship and Dependency. Sheriff Matthews adjusted his spectacles, scanning the papers with careful attention. "Everything appears to be in order, Miss Tilden. Mr. Brand has established himself as your legal guardian, providing you protection and residence on his property up in Thunder Valley." I don't understand," Mercy whispered, her voice trembling. She turned to look at Nolan, who stood quietly by the window, his broad shoulders outlined against the falling snow outside. "Means you're under my protection now," Nolan explained softly. "Legal and proper. No one can force you to go anywhere you don't want to." The sheriff nodded, running his finger down the page. "County clerk's signature is right here, dated today. Brand came in this afternoon and filed all the necessary paperwork. Paid the fees, too." Mercy's hand flew to her throat, tears welling in her eyes. "You planned this? Before you found me on the church steps?" "Been watching how they treated you," Nolan replied, his voice low but firm. "Saw your uncle making plans with them Denver folks. Couldn't let that happen?" Before Mercy could respond, the office door burst open with a bang that made her jump. Reverend Tilden stormed in, bringing a blast of cold air and swirling snow with him. His face was red with fury beneath his black hat, and his usually immaculate clerical collar was askew. "This is outrageous," the preacher thundered. "Sheriff Matthews, I demand you arrest this man immediately. He's kidnapping my niece." Nolan didn't move from his position by the window, but his stance shifted slightly, ready but not threatening. "No kidnapping here, Reverend. Everything's legal and witnessed." The sheriff held up the papers. "He's right, Reverend. Mr. Brand has filed for legal wardship of Miss Tilden, all properly done through the county clerk's office." "Impossible," Reverend Tilden sputtered. "She's my responsibility. I won't have this mountain man making a mockery of—" "Your responsibility?" Nolan's quiet words cut through the preacher's bluster like a knife. "That why you were fixing to ship her off to that asylum? That what you call taking responsibility?" The Reverend's face darkened. "How dare you question my judgment? I've cared for that girl for 15 years, dealt with her condition. The asylum is for her own good." Mercy flinched at her uncle's words, shrinking deeper into her chair. But when she spoke, her voice was surprisingly steady. "You never wanted me, Uncle. Not since Mother died. I've tried so hard to be useful, to not be a burden, but nothing I do is ever enough." "Now see here," the Reverend began, but Sheriff Matthews held up his hand. "Papers are in order, Reverend. Mr. Brand's within his rights. Miss Tilden's of age to accept wardship, and there's nothing illegal about the arrangement." The sheriff's words carried the weight of law, and even Reverend Tilden seemed to deflate slightly. He turned to Mercy, his expression a mixture of anger and wounded pride. "Very well. If you choose to throw away years of Christian charity for this, then so be it. But don't come crying to me when you realize your mistake." The Reverend stormed out, leaving behind a heavy silence broken only by the ticking of the sheriff's clock and the soft whine of wind through the window frames. Mercy's shoulders shook with silent tears, but she held herself upright, refusing to collapse under the weight of her uncle's rejection. Sheriff Matthews cleared his throat. "Well then, let's get these papers, filed proper." He carefully recorded the details in his ledger, then handed the original documents back to Nolan. "Take good care of her, Brand. Town's got eyes on you both now." "Much obliged, Sheriff," Nolan replied, tucking the papers safely away. He turned to Mercy, his voice gentling. "Ready to head home, Miss Tilden?" Home. The word hung in the air between them, full of promise and uncertainty. Mercy nodded, using her cane to push herself carefully to her feet. Nolan moved to her side, not touching her, but ready to help if needed. Outside, the snow had begun to ease, but the wind still bit sharp and cold. The street was far from empty. Townsfolk lined the boardwalks, pretending to go about their business while watching the scene unfold. Whispers followed them like shadows as Nolan helped Mercy toward his wagon. "Scandalous, that's what it is. Poor thing, doesn't know what she's getting into. That Brand's gone plumb crazy, taking in a crippled girl." Nolan ignored the gossip, focusing instead on helping Mercy climb onto the wagon seat. Her movements were practiced and determined, though he could see the strain it took. Once she was settled, he reached into the back of the wagon and pulled out a thick wool blanket, dark green with a pattern of arrows woven in brown. "Here now," he said, draping it carefully around her shoulders. "Night's getting cold." The simple kindness of the gesture brought fresh tears to Mercy's eyes, but she blinked them back, managing a small, "Thank you." Nolan climbed up beside her and took the reins. The wagon creaked as they started moving, the horses' hooves making soft, crunching sounds in the fresh snow. As they passed the church, Mercy couldn't help looking back at the steps where she'd sat just hours before, certain her life was ending. Now she wasn't sure if she was being rescued or ruined. The familiar buildings of Calico Ridge fell away behind them as the wagon began its slow climb up the mountain trail. The path was treacherous in the gathering dusk, but Nolan handled the reins with quiet confidence, guiding the horses around patches of ice and deep snow. That's when she heard it. So faint at first she thought she was imagining things. Nolan was humming, the melody barely audible above the wagon's creaking and the horses' steady breathing. Mercy's heart caught as she recognized the tune. Sweet Hour of Prayer. It had been her mother's favorite hymn, the one she'd sung while working in their little garden when Mercy was small. The familiar melody wrapped around her like a warm embrace, and something inside her chest began to unknot. She found herself humming along softly, their voices blending in the growing darkness. Nolan didn't comment, or even look her way, but she saw the corner of his mouth lift slightly. By the time they reached the timberline, night had fully fallen. Stars pricked through gaps in the clouds overhead, scattering silver light across the snow-covered landscape. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. Ahead, through the trees, a warm light flickered. Nolan's cabin, glowing like a beacon in the darkness. Mercy huddled deeper into the blanket, watching that steady light grow closer. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, she felt something she'd almost forgotten. Peace. Not happiness, not yet, but a quiet certainty that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. The wagon continued its slow climb toward the waiting light, carrying its precious cargo home through the star-filled night. The wagon creaked to a halt in front of the cabin. Snow had packed the yard smooth and white, broken only by Nolan's earlier tracks and a narrow path leading to the barn. Moonlight caught the frost crystals, making them sparkle like scattered diamonds across the untouched drifts. Nolan set the brake and climbed down, his boots crunching in the snow. He moved to Mercy's side of the wagon, standing ready but not rushing her. "Take your time," he said softly. "Steps can be tricky in the dark." Mercy gripped her cane tightly, studying the drop to the ground. Even with help, dismounting wagons had always been a challenge for her twisted leg. But Nolan's steady presence gave her courage to try. She shifted carefully towards the edge, and Nolan's strong hands found her waist, lifting her as if she weighed no more than a child. He set her gently on her feet, making sure she was steady before stepping back. The consideration in his touch brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, blinking them away before they could freeze on her cheeks. Nolan just nodded and turned to unhitch the horses. "Let's get you inside where it's warm." The cabin stood before them, sturdy and welcoming. Hand-hewn logs fitted together with careful precision, their edges softened by years of wind and weather. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, promising warmth within. A small covered porch protected the front door, its roof heavy with snow. Mercy made her way carefully up the 2 wooden steps, leaning heavily on her cane. The porch boards were solid under her feet, swept clear of snow. Everything about the place spoke of careful maintenance, of quiet pride in honest work. Nolan opened the door, and warmth wrapped around her like a blanket. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The cabin's single room was neat and orderly, if sparse. A bed stood in one corner, its quilt pulled tight. A wooden table with 2 chairs sat near the window. Shelves lined one wall, holding books, tools, and provisions. A black cook stove gleamed near the fireplace, and she could smell coffee brewing. "It's not much," Nolan said behind her, almost apologetically, "but it's dry and warm." Mercy stepped inside, taking in every detail. The floor was swept clean, the windows washed. A Bible lay on the table beside an oil lamp. Everything had its place. Everything served a purpose. It felt peaceful. Her eyes fixed on the second chair at the table, its wood worn smooth from years of use. "You live alone?" she whispered, though she already knew the answer. Nolan moved past her to check the coffee, his broad shoulders tense. "Yes," he said simply. But in that single word, Mercy heard volumes of unspoken grief. She watched him pour coffee into a tin cup with hands that never shook, and knew better than to ask about the shadows behind his eyes. "Coffee's hot if you'd like some," he offered, changing the subject. "Need to get the horses settled. Then I'll fix up a proper place for you to sleep." While he was gone, Mercy sipped her coffee and studied her new home. The fire's warmth began to thaw her frozen fingers and toes. Everything smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and pine. Clean, honest smells that reminded her of her father's study before he died. Nolan returned carrying extra blankets and what looked like a folding cot. Without ceremony, he set it up near the stove, where the warmth would reach it best. He arranged the blankets carefully, even adding an extra pillow he retrieved from a chest. "You'll sleep here," he said, straightening up. "I'll bed down in the barn." Mercy started to protest, but he held up a hand. "Got a good setup out there for when weather's bad. More proper this way." She understood then. He was protecting not just her safety, but her reputation as well. Even here, miles from town, he was considering her honor. The realization brought a warm flush to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." He nodded once, picked up a lantern, and headed for the door. "Lock up behind me. Sleep well, Miss Tilden." After he left, Mercy sat for a long time in the second chair, listening to the fire pop and watching shadows dance on the walls. The events of the day felt almost dreamlike. The church steps, the sheriff's office, the long ride up the mountain. Yet here she was, safe and warm, with a roof over her head and no asylum in her future. She changed into her nightgown behind a blanket hung for privacy, then settled onto the cot. The blankets were clean and soft, smelling faintly of cedar. Through the window she could see the barn where a lantern still glowed. The knowledge that Nolan was near brought unexpected comfort. Sleep came easier than she'd expected, rocked by the gentle crackle of the fire and the distant hooting of an owl. Morning arrived with crystalline clarity, sunlight streaming through frost-covered windows and painting patterns on the floor. Mercy woke slowly, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar surroundings. But the events of yesterday came flooding back as she saw the note propped against a bowl on the table. She reached for it with trembling fingers. The writing was careful and clear. "You're safe here. Rest easy." Beside the note sat a bowl of steaming porridge, sweetened with dried berries and a hot drizzle of honey. The thoughtfulness of it brought tears to her eyes. How long had it been since anyone had shown her such simple kindness? After eating, she refused to remain idle. Her leg ached from yesterday's excitement, but she was determined to be useful. She began with small tasks, straightening the blankets on her cot, washing the breakfast dishes, sweeping the already clean floor. As she worked, she found herself humming her mother's favorite hymns, the familiar melodies bringing comfort to this strange new life. She discovered a basket of mending by the window and settled in with needle and thread, grateful for work she could do while resting her leg. The cabin slowly filled with the sound of her soft singing as she darted the needle in and out of worn shirts and socks. The short winter day passed quickly. She kept the fire fed and made a pot of beans for supper, finding satisfaction in these simple tasks. As dusk approached, she heard the rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood. Through the window she could see Nolan working steadily, his breath clouding in the cold air. The pile of split wood grew as the light faded. She noticed how he favored his left side slightly, though he never slowed his pace. He paused once, head tilted, and she realized he was listening to her singing. She almost stopped, embarrassed, but made herself continue the hymn. After a moment, he resumed his work, but his movements seemed lighter somehow. When the last light was nearly gone, his boots scraped on the porch. She heard him pause outside the door, still listening to her voice. Then he stepped inside, bringing a blast of cold air and the clean scent of fresh-cut wood. Mercy looked up from her mending, suddenly shy. "I hope you don't mind," she said quickly. "I found things to do." "Mind?" He shook his head, stamping snow from his boots. "Place hasn't looked this right in years." The quiet approval in his voice warmed her more than the fire ever could. She watched him move around the cabin with easy familiarity, hanging up his coat, adding wood to the fire, pouring coffee with the same careful attention he gave to every task. The silence between them was comfortable, broken only by the pop of the fire and the gentle clicking of her needle. Outside, snow began falling again, but inside the cabin, warmth and peace reigned. For the first time in years, Mercy felt truly safe. And though Nolan said little, the tension had eased from his shoulders, as if his solitary fortress had somehow been waiting all along for the sound of hymns and the quiet presence of another soul. They spent that evening in companionable silence, each absorbed in their own tasks, but aware of the other's presence. The walls that had so long echoed emptiness now held the soft sounds of shared living, the scrape of Nolan's knife as he carved a piece of wood, the whisper of Mercy's thread through fabric, the gentle murmur of the fire. Neither felt the need to fill the quiet with words. When night fell fully, Nolan once again took his leave to sleep in the barn, but not before making sure the fire was well stocked, and Mercy had everything she needed. She watched his lantern light bob through the darkness to the barn, then settled onto her cot, wrapped in the peace of knowing she was truly safe. The cabin held its warmth, cradling its occupants in the gentle rhythm of their new shared life. Outside, snow continued to fall, adding another layer of quiet to the mountain night. Inside, two lonely souls began the slow dance of learning to trust again, each offering what they could, he with his quiet protection, she with her gentle presence, building something new from the ashes of their separate sorrows. The days melted together like snowflakes on the window pane. Each morning, Mercy woke to find the world transformed anew, thick white blankets coating every surface as far as she could see from the cabin windows. The steady snowfall created a peaceful isolation that wrapped around the cabin like a protective embrace. On her third morning, Nolan gestured for her to join him by the iron stove. "Best you learn how to manage this," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Gets mighty cold up here if the fire dies." Mercy hobbled closer, watching intently as his weathered hands demonstrated how to bank the coals, add kindling, and adjust the damper. His movements were precise, each motion practiced over countless mornings. "Like this?" she asked, attempting to mimic his careful arrangement of wood and paper. "That's right," he nodded, the ghost of a smile crossing his face as the kindling caught. "Keep the wood stacked just so and she'll burn steady all day." The lesson expanded to other practical matters. Nolan showed her where he kept the oil for the lamps, taught her how to trim the wicks, and explained which curtains needed mending before the winter winds grew stronger. Cooper, Nolan's faithful hound, became her constant companion during these lessons. The dog shadowed her movements with gentle attention, somehow sensing her unsteady gait and positioning himself where she might need support. "He's taken quite a shine to you," Nolan observed one afternoon, watching as Cooper helped Mercy balance while hanging freshly mended curtains. "Where did you get him?" she asked, scratching behind Cooper's ears. Nolan's face grew distant. "Gift from a Ute friend, back when I trapped for the army." He fell silent, and Mercy saw shadows gather in his eyes. "You were with the army?" she prompted softly. He nodded, running a hand through his beard. "During the war. Left after." His words trailed off, but the weight of unspoken guilt hung heavy in the air. Mercy didn't press further, recognizing the burden of memories too painful to share. As the days passed, Mercy's struggles with walking became increasingly apparent. Her twisted leg, long a source of shame, made even the simplest tasks challenging. Nolan watched her quiet determination, noted how she gritted her teeth against the pain but pressed on with her daily tasks. One evening, after supper, he settled into his chair by the fire and began working with a piece of pine wood. Mercy observed from her seat as his knife moved with sure, steady strokes, slowly revealing the shape hidden within the wood. Hours passed, marked only by the soft scraping of blade against wood and the occasional pop from the fireplace. Finally, Nolan held up the finished piece, a smooth, perfectly balanced walking cane. He worked oil into the wood until it gleamed in the lamplight, then presented it to Mercy without ceremony. "Should help with your balance," he said simply. Mercy's fingers trembled as she accepted the gift. The wood was warm and satiny beneath her touch, the grip carved to fit her hand perfectly. Tears welled in her eyes as she realized the hours of careful work he'd put into creating something just for her. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, clutching the cane to her chest. Nolan shifted uncomfortably at her emotion. "No need for thanks. Just put it to good use." That evening, as Mercy prepared their simple supper of beans and cornbread, she found herself overwhelmed with gratitude. For the roof over her head, for Cooper's steady presence, for Nolan's quiet kindness. Without thinking, she bowed her head and began to pray aloud. "Dear Lord, we thank you for this food." The words came hesitantly at first, then gained strength as she continued. She hadn't said grace aloud since her mother's passing, the practice too painful a reminder of their shared faith. When she opened her eyes, she found Nolan watching her, his own head awkwardly bowed. Though he said nothing, the simple gesture of respect touched her deeply. Later that night, as the wind howled outside like a wild thing, they sat by the fire's warmth. The storm had driven Nolan inside rather than to his usual place in the barn, and an unusual openness settled between them. "Tell me about your mother," he said quietly, surprising her with the request. Mercy's hands stilled in her mending. "She was the kindest person I've ever known," she began slowly. "Even after my accident, when the doctors said I'd never walk right again, she never treated me as less than whole." "What happened?" His voice was gentle. "Fell from a horse when I was 8. Broke my leg badly." She touched her twisted limb. "It never healed proper. After that, most folks looked at me with pity or disgust. But Mama, she'd say God doesn't make mistakes, that every life has purpose." Wise woman. She was. Mercy wiped away a tear. "When the fever took her, it felt like all the light went out of the world. Uncle, he means well, but he sees me as a burden. Mama saw me as a blessing." Nolan was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Lost my faith after the war," he admitted finally. "Saw things, did things, made me wonder if God was listening at all." "But you still remember the hymns?" Mercy said softly, recalling his humming on their first journey to the cabin. "Some things stick with you, I reckon, like your mama's wisdom about purpose." They shared more stories as the night deepened, tales of loss and hope, of struggles and small victories. Nolan spoke haltingly of his time with the army, of friendships forged and broken, of decisions that still haunted his dreams. Mercy told him about her father's death when she was small, about her mother's unwavering faith, about the years of loneliness after being sent to live with her uncle. The wind continued its wild song outside, but inside the cabin, something fragile and precious was taking root. Their words, once offered hesitantly, began to flow more freely, filling the space between them with understanding. As the week drew to a close, Mercy's progress was evident to them both. The cane Nolan had carved became an extension of her body, helping her move with growing confidence. She learned to anticipate the cabin's uneven floorboards, to balance herself against furniture when needed, to accept Cooper's steady presence at her side. One morning, as sunlight streamed through the frost-covered windows, Mercy rose from her chair by the fire and walked slowly but steadily across the room to the stove. She didn't stumble once. When she turned back, she found Nolan watching her, a quiet smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The smile transformed his entire face, softening the weather-worn lines and bringing light to his eyes. It was the first true smile she'd seen from him, and it warmed her heart more than any fire could. That evening, as they sat in their usual places by the hearth, Mercy realized something had shifted between them. The silence that filled the cabin was no longer the hollow emptiness of loneliness, but rather the comfortable quiet of shared understanding. Her hymns and prayers no longer felt out of place in this mountain sanctuary, and Nolan's brooding presence had gentled into something more peaceful. Cooper lay between them, his head resting on Mercy's foot, while Nolan worked on another piece of wood, and Mercy continued her mending. Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside the cabin, winter's chill had given way to the first tender shoots of healing, for both body and soul. The transformation was subtle, but undeniable. Like the gradual lengthening of days after the winter solstice, hope was returning to their lives one small moment at a time. Mercy's steps grew stronger, her voice more confident when she prayed or sang. And Nolan, though still a man of few words, began to carry himself as if some of the weight had lifted from his shoulders. They had each carried their own kinds of lameness, hers physical, his spiritual. But in helping her heal, Nolan seemed to be finding his own path back to faith, one careful step at a time. And in accepting his help, Mercy was discovering strength she never knew she possessed. As the Teuf week drew to a close, the snow finally began to ease. The world outside remained hushed and white, but the howling winds had gentled to whispers. Inside the cabin, two wounded souls continued their careful dance of healing, each supporting the other in ways neither had expected, but both desperately needed. The late February sun hung low in the afternoon sky, casting long shadows across the snow-covered mountain. Inside the warm cabin, Mercy hummed softly as she worked at the rough-hewn table, measuring and cutting fabric for new curtains. The old ones, threadbare and faded, had seen better days, and she'd been saving scraps of cheerful calico to brighten the cabin's windows. Cooper lay sprawled near the stove, his tail thumping occasionally against the floorboards when Mercy's hymns reached his favorite parts. She smiled at the hound's musical appreciation, remembering how quickly he'd accepted her presence in their lives. These past weeks, the dog had become her constant companion whenever Nolan was out working, as faithful as any guardian angel. The thought of Nolan made her pause in her sewing. He'd left at dawn to ride down to the post office, the first time she'd been truly alone since that snowy night he'd brought her here. though the solitude felt strange after so many days of quiet companionship. She wasn't afraid. The cabin had become home, its walls holding memories of shared meals, evening prayers, and slowly healing hearts. Mercy smoothed the fabric beneath her hands, admiring the pattern of tiny blue flowers that reminded her of spring. Though winter still held the mountain in its grip, recent days had brought hints of the changing season, icicles dripping in the afternoon sun, patches of bare ground showing through the thinning snow, and the return of bird song in the evergreens. "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound," she sang softly, guiding the needle through the cloth with practiced ease. The familiar hymn filled the cabin's comfortable silence, mixing with the snap and pop of burning logs in the fireplace. Cooper's eyes drooped contentedly as her voice rose and fell with the beloved verses. The afternoon light was growing golden when Mercy heard hoofbeats approaching through the snow. She set aside her nearly finished curtains and reached for her cane, making her way to the window. Nolan's broad-shouldered figure appeared through the trees, his horse picking its way carefully along the familiar trail. Something in his posture made her pause. Though he sat straight as always, there was a tension in his shoulders she hadn't seen since those first uncertain days of her arrival. Cooper must have sensed it too, for he rose and padded to the door, whining softly. Mercy busied herself brewing fresh coffee, knowing Nolan would appreciate its warmth after the long ride. The cabin door opened with a blast of cold air, and she turned to greet him with a smile that faltered when she saw his face. His usual weathered complexion had gone pale, his eyes troubled as he removed his snow-dusted hat. "Welcome home," she said softly, the words coming naturally now after weeks of shared domesticity. "The coffee's nearly ready." Nolan nodded his thanks, but remained standing near the door, one hand thrust deep in his coat pocket. Cooper pressed against his leg, sensing his master's distress, but Nolan barely seemed to notice the dog's presence. "Something's wrong," Mercy said. It wasn't a question. Nolan drew a folded paper from his pocket, the crisp government letterhead visible even from across the room. "Got this at the post office," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "From the county office." Mercy's heart began to pound. Had her uncle found some legal way to force her return? Had someone challenged Nolan's wardship? She gripped her cane tighter, steadying herself against the sudden wave of fear. "What does it say?" Nolan crossed to the fireplace, his movements deliberate as he unfolded the letter. The firelight caught the official seal at the top of the page, casting dancing shadows across the formal text. "Railroad survey crew came through last month," he said slowly. "Found something in these hills they want badly." "Found what?" "Silver." He almost spat the word. "Rich vein running right under this homestead. Letter says my claim might not be valid unless—" He trailed off, refolding the paper with careful precision. Mercy's mind raced. She knew the stories of other mountain folk who'd lost their land to the railroad companies, of homes and farms swallowed up by the ever-expanding tracks of progress. "Unless what?" "Unless I can prove lawful family occupancy." Nolan's voice was gentle now, almost apologetic. "They don't recognize wardship as strong enough claim. They'll take everything. The cabin, the land, all of it." The fire crackled in the hearth, sending up a shower of sparks as a log shifted. Mercy stared at the dancing flames, trying to comprehend what this meant for their future. "There must be something we can do," she whispered. "Might be." Nolan's boots scraped against the floorboards as he took a step closer. "We might have to marry before spring." The words hung in the air between them like smoke, impossible to catch or dismiss. Mercy's fingers trembled against her cane as she lifted her eyes to his face, searching for some sign that she'd misheard. But Nolan's expression was serious, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of resignation and something else she couldn't quite name. The cabin seemed suddenly too warm, too small to contain the weight of this moment. Through the window, she could see the last rays of sunset painting the snow-covered mountains in shades of rose and gold. The same mountains that had become her sanctuary, her place of healing and hope. The thought of losing this haven made her chest ache. Marriage? She finally managed to whisper the word. Nolan ran a hand through his beard, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of discomfort. "Ain't what either of us planned," he admitted, "but it would make the claims solid, give us legal right to stay." Us, she noticed, not him alone, but both of them. In the weeks since he'd brought her here, they'd formed an unlikely partnership built on mutual respect and quiet understanding. He'd given her safety when she needed it most, asked nothing in return, except the chance to help her heal. And now he was offering her something more, a way to secure their shared future, even if it meant binding their lives together in ways neither had imagined. The fire popped again, and Cooper whined softly, moving between them as if trying to bridge the sudden distance. Mercy's mind whirled with implications. Marriage wasn't something to enter lightly. Her mother had taught her that. It was a sacred covenant, not just a legal arrangement. But hadn't there already been something sacred in the way Nolan had offered her sanctuary? In the gentle respect he showed her, the quiet faith he was slowly rediscovering alongside her? When? The question surprised her even as it left her lips. Letter says they'll start proceedings in spring. Nolan's voice remained steady, but she could hear the underlying tension. Would need to be before then. Give us time to file the proper papers, make it official. Mercy's fingers found the smooth wood of the cane he'd carved for her, drawing comfort from its familiar touch. Before spring, she repeated softly. Outside, an evening wind stirred the trees, their branches casting shifting shadows across the snow. Spring wasn't far off. Already the days were lengthening, the sun growing stronger. Nolan moved to add another log to the fire, his movements careful and deliberate. "Ain't asking for your answer now," he said, not looking at her. "Take time to think on it. Pray on it if you need to." He straightened, finally turning to meet her gaze. "Whatever you decide, I'll respect it. Find some other way if I have to." But they both knew there might not be another way. The railroad companies were powerful, their influence reaching even into these remote mountains. Without the protection of a legal family claim, the land could be taken, their home destroyed, their peaceful existence shattered. Mercy closed her eyes, remembering her mother's words about God's purpose in all things. Was this his plan all along? Had he guided Nolan to rescue her that snowy night, knowing they would need each other for more than just immediate salvation? The coffee pot began to bubble on the stove, its familiar aroma filling the cabin. Such a simple thing, yet it represented all they'd built together. The daily rhythms of shared meals, quiet conversations, and growing trust. The thought of losing it all made her heart clench. When she opened her eyes again, she found Nolan watching her with that same gentle patience he'd shown since the beginning. He wasn't pushing for an answer, wasn't trying to influence her decision. Even now, facing the loss of everything he'd built, he was giving her the freedom to choose. The embers crackled in the hearth, sending up another shower of sparks. Outside, the last light of day was fading, turning the snow-covered world to shades of blue and silver. Mercy stood there, balanced between her cane and her future, while the weight of decision settled around her like a mantle. Morning light crept through the frost-covered windows, painting pale patterns across the cabin's wooden floor. Mercy sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, but her eyes remained fixed on the window. Outside, Nolan worked steadily at his grindstone, the rhythmic scraping sound carrying through the glass as he sharpened his tools. Every time he glanced toward the cabin, Mercy found herself looking away. The weight of last night's conversation pressed heavily on her heart, making it impossible to meet his gaze. Instead, she watched his reflection in the window, noting how his shoulders seemed tenser than usual, his movements more deliberate. The morning's Bible lay open before her, but she hadn't turned a page in nearly an hour. Her mother's old leather bookmark held her place at Proverbs, though her thoughts were far from the wisdom written there. She closed her eyes, trying to form the words of prayer that usually came so naturally. "Lord," she whispered, her breath fogging the cold window pane, "show me your path in this." Her fingers traced the smooth wood of her cane, the one Nolan had carved with such care. "Is this your provision? Or am I merely grasping at safety?" The grindstone's whine paused, and she heard Nolan's boots crunching in the snow as he moved to another task. Cooper, his faithful hound, followed close behind, leaving paired tracks in the fresh powder. The sight brought an unexpected warmth to her chest. How quickly she'd grown accustomed to these simple rhythms of mountain life. Throughout the morning, they moved in their usual pattern, but the air felt charged with unspoken words. Mercy tended to her indoor tasks, making bread, sweeping the floor, feeding kindling to the hungry stove. Nolan worked outside, coming in only briefly to warm his hands by the fire. Each time, their eyes would almost meet, then slide away, like two scared deer at a waterhole. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow, Mercy's thoughts turned to supper preparation. The familiar task of peeling potatoes and stirring the stew pot helped calm her racing mind. She had just set the table when Nolan came in, stamping snow from his boots. "Smells good," he said quietly, hanging his coat by the door. It was the first words they'd spoken since breakfast. "It's nearly ready," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. They sat down to eat, the silence broken only by the clink of spoons against bowls and the pop of the fire. Mercy found herself studying Nolan's face in quick glances, the way firelight caught in his beard, the careful way he broke his bread, the shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of a restless night. Finally, Nolan cleared his throat. "About what I said last night," he began, his voice gentle but firm. "I need you to understand something." Mercy's hands stilled in her lap as she waited. "It's only for protection," he continued, choosing his words with obvious care. "Nothing changes unless you wish it. We'd share the cabin like we do now, keep to our separate spaces. Just..." He paused, searching for the right words. "With paper to back our claim." The tenderness in his voice made her throat tighten. In all her years, no man had ever spoken to her with such gentle consideration. Not her uncle, who saw her twisted leg as God's punishment. Not the townsman, who looked through her as if she were invisible. Even the doctor who'd treated her childhood injury had been brusque and dismissive. But here was Nolan Brand, former Army scout and mountain man, offering her both protection and dignity in the same breath. The realization brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "I'll need time," she managed to say, "to pray on it proper." Nolan nodded, relief visible in the slight loosening of his shoulders. "Take all the time you need. Ain't nothing has to be decided tonight." After supper, while Nolan went to check on his horse in the barn, Mercy sat at the table with paper and pen. The letter to her uncle had been forming in her mind all day, but now that she faced the blank page, words came slowly. "Dear Uncle Matthew," she wrote, her handwriting careful and measured, I pray this letter finds you well. I am safe and cared for, though I know my departure caused you worry and pain." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "I ask your forgiveness for leaving without proper goodbye, but I believe God has guided my path to this mountain." She wrote of the cabin's simple comforts, of Nolan's respectful treatment, of finding strength in her legs she thought long lost. But she said nothing of the railroad's threat or the possibility of marriage. Those burdens were not yet ready to be shared. Outside, snow began falling again, thick flakes swirling past the windows like cotton bits caught in a spring wind. Mercy watched them dance as she sealed the envelope, wondering if her uncle would understand that sometimes God's mercy came wrapped in unexpected packages. The evening grew deeper, and Nolan returned from the barn, bringing a blast of cold air with him. He added wood to the fire, while Mercy prepared their evening tea, another quiet ritual they'd developed over the weeks. As the flames grew higher, casting warm light across the cabin's walls, Mercy gathered her courage. "May I ask you something?" she said softly. Nolan looked up from stoking the fire. "Course." "Do you truly believe God forgives anyone?" The question had been burning in her heart since his proposal, though its roots reached back to her childhood struggles with faith and worthiness. Nolan was quiet, for a long moment, watching the flames dance. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. Even mountain men with blood on their hands. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken history. Mercy knew pieces of his past, hints of battles fought, lives lost, guilt carried, but she'd never pressed for details. Now, watching his face in the firelight, she saw both shadow and hope there. "The Lord's mercy is bigger than our sins," she said softly, remembering her mother's favorite scripture. "Wider than the mountains, deeper than the valleys." Nolan's eyes met hers across the fire-lit room, and for the first time that day, neither looked away. Something shifted in the air between them, like a door opening to let in fresh spring air. The tension that had wrapped around them since his proposal began to soften, replaced by something warmer, more sacred. Cooper, sensing the change in mood, moved from his place by the fire to rest his head on Mercy's knee. She scratched behind his ears, drawing comfort from his solid presence. The dog had accepted her from the first day, as if he'd known she belonged here before anyone else did. As the fire dimmed to glowing coals, Mercy felt peace settling over her like a warm blanket. Perhaps this wasn't the path she'd imagined for herself, but hadn't her mother always said God's ways were higher than human understanding? Looking at Nolan's profile as he gazed into the fire, she began to see their situation in a new light. What she'd first feared might be shameful, a marriage of convenience to save their land, now seemed more like divine providence. The snow continued falling outside, adding another layer of white to the mountain's winter blanket. Inside the cabin, two souls who'd thought themselves beyond redemption sat in comfortable silence, while something holy stirred in the spaces between their hearts. "Good night," Mercy said finally, rising carefully with her cane. "And thank you." "For what?" Nolan asked, his voice soft in the dim light. "For giving me choice in this. For making me feel—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Worthy of gentle handling." Nolan's expression softened, though he said nothing. He didn't need to. His respect spoke louder than words ever could. As Mercy prepared for bed, she heard him moving quietly through his evening routine, banking the fire, checking the doors, speaking low to Cooper. Such simple sounds, yet they had become the melody of safety in her world. Whatever tomorrow might bring, she knew God's hand was in this unexpected sanctuary. 3 weeks after Nolan's unexpected proposal, Winter's grip began to loosen its hold on Calico Ridge. Patches of muddy earth appeared between melting snowdrifts, and morning brought the first tentative songs of returning birds. Nolan hitched his wagon early that morning, preparing for the monthly supply run into town. Mercy stood in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl against the crisp air, watching him secure empty flour sacks in the wagon bed. "You certain you'll be all right alone?" he asked, adjusting the harness on his bay mare. "Cooper and I will manage just fine," Mercy assured him, one hand resting on the dog's head. Her other hand gripped the smooth pine cane Nolan had carved for her. "We've got bread till sundown, and I can tend the fire proper now." Nolan nodded, though concern still creased his forehead. It would be his longest time away since bringing her to the cabin. "I'll try to be back before dark," he said, climbing onto the wagon seat. "Bar the door while I'm gone." Mercy watched until the wagon disappeared around the bend, then turned her attention to her morning tasks. She had grown stronger over the weeks, learning to navigate the cabin's spaces with increasing confidence. Her twisted legs still ached, especially when storms approached, but daily movement had built strength she never knew she possessed. Down in Calico Ridge, Nolan's wagon creaked past the church just as morning service was ending. He kept his eyes forward, but couldn't help noticing how conversations stopped and heads turned as he passed. Whispers followed in his wake like autumn leaves. At the general store, he heard fragments of conversation through the open door while loading flour sacks. "Living in sin up there, mark my words. Poor girl. Probably frightened out of her wits. Preacher Tilden says the devil works in mysterious ways." Nolan's jaw tightened, but he focused on his task. Let them talk. Mercy's safety mattered more than town gossip. Inside the church, Preacher Matthew Tilden stood at his pulpit, his voice rising with righteous anger. "Beware the wolf who clothes himself in sheep's wool," he thundered to his remaining congregation. "Who preys upon the innocent and vulnerable among us?" The assembled townspeople shifted uncomfortably in their pews. Everyone knew who he meant. "This very morning, while we worship," the preacher continued, "my own flesh and blood remains captive in that godless mountain cabin, led astray by a man with blood on his hands and darkness in his soul." Deputy James Lyle sat in the back pew, his conscience troubled. He had known Nolan Brand during the war years, a quiet man who'd treated prisoners with unexpected mercy. The deputy had also seen how Preacher Tilden treated his niece, keeping her hidden away, like something shameful. As the service ended, the deputy made his decision. He would ride up to the cabin himself and see the truth of things. Back at the cabin, Mercy was hanging fresh curtains she'd sewn from fabric Nolan brought her weeks ago. The soft calico brightened the room, making it feel more like a home than a haven. She had just finished the last window when Cooper's bark alerted her to approaching hoofbeats. Her heart quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. Through the window, she saw a man in a deputy's badge riding up the path. Not Nolan's wagon returning early, then. Cooper positioned himself between Mercy and the door as bootsteps crossed the porch. A firm knock followed. "Miss Tilden?" called a voice she recognized as Deputy Lyle's. "I need to speak with you, miss." Mercy squared her shoulders, smoothed her apron, and gripped her cane firmly. She had nothing to hide and nothing to fear. When she opened the door, she stood tall in the frame, her chin lifted. Deputy Lyle blinked, clearly surprised by her appearance. Instead of a frightened captive, he found a composed young woman, clean and well-kept, standing in a tidy cabin that smelled of soap and fresh bread. "Can I help you, Deputy?" Mercy asked politely. The deputy removed his hat, suddenly feeling foolish about his mission. "Just checking on your welfare, miss. There's been talk in town." "I'm here by my own will," Mercy stated firmly, her voice carrying the quiet strength she'd discovered in herself these past weeks. Mr. Brand has treated me with nothing but respect and kindness. Deputy Lyle nodded slowly, noting the new curtains, the swept floor, the mended quilt on her cot. All signs of a woman making a home, not a prisoner being held against her will. Your uncle is concerned, he said carefully. My uncle, Mercy replied, had plans to send me to an asylum in Denver. Mr. Brand offered me sanctuary instead. I chose to accept it. The deputy shifted uncomfortably. He had heard rumors of the preacher's plans, but hadn't wanted to believe them. Looking at Mercy now, standing straight despite her twisted leg, her eyes clear and unafraid, he couldn't imagine her locked away in an institution. Well then, he said, replacing his hat. I reckon that settles things. He turned to go, then paused. Miss Tilden? Yes? I served with Brand during the war. He's a good man, whatever folks might say. Mercy's expression softened. I know, Deputy. I know. She watched him ride away, his horse's hooves leaving fresh marks in the melting snow. Only when he disappeared from view did she realize she was trembling, not from fear, but from the strange new feeling of standing up for herself. The afternoon passed slowly as Mercy waited for Nolan's return. She kept her hands busy kneading dough for cornbread, something she'd been wanting to try on her own. Her mother had taught her the recipe years ago, before the fever took her, and the familiar motions brought comfort. The sun was setting when she finally heard Nolan's wagon. She opened the door to find him looking worn and troubled as he unloaded supplies. The deputy came today, she told him as they carried sacks inside. Nolan's expression darkened. Did he frighten you? No, she said simply. I told him the truth, that I'm here by choice. Later, as they sat by the fire, Nolan broke their comfortable silence. I'm sorry for bringing you trouble, he said quietly. The talk in town, your uncle's sermon. Mercy looked up from her mending. They called me useless before you gave me a name, worth keeping, she said softly. Their words can't hurt me anymore. Nolan studied her face in the firelight, seeing the strength that had always been there, waiting to bloom. The scared girl he'd found crying on the church steps had grown into something remarkable. I made cornbread, she announced, rising carefully with her cane. My first full meal prepared alone. You didn't have to. I wanted to, she interrupted gently, to thank you for seeing worth in me when no one else did. The cornbread was slightly burnt on the bottom and a bit too crumbly on top. But as they shared it with fresh butter and honey, Nolan couldn't remember tasting anything finer. Here in this simple cabin, with Cooper dozing by the fire and Mercy humming softly as she poured tea, he had found something he thought lost forever. Peace. The flames crackled low as they finished their meal. Outside, an early spring wind whispered through bare branches, promising change. Inside, two souls who had found unexpected sanctuary in each other's company sat in comfortable silence, sharing the last crumbs of cornbread and the quiet certainty that they were exactly where they needed to be. March arrived with a fury, bringing winds that howled down from the mountain peaks and rattled the cabin's wooden shutters. Mercy sat by the window, watching pine boughs sway against the clouding sky, while her fingers worked steadily at mending one of Nolan's shirts. The familiar rhythm of needle and thread helped calm her growing anxiety about the railroad company's threats to their land. Cooper lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws. The hound's ears perked up before Mercy heard the approaching hoofbeats. Through the window she spotted Nolan riding hard up the trail, his coat billowing behind him. Something in his urgent pace made her heart skip. He dismounted quickly, patting his horse's neck before striding toward the cabin. When he stepped inside, his face was grim. Without a word, he pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and handed it to Mercy. Her fingers trembled as she opened the telegram. The stark black letters seemed to burn into her vision. Hearing date, set, stop April 5th. Stop family occupancy proof required. Stop Judge Harrison presiding, stop. 4 weeks, Nolan said quietly, hanging his coat by the door. That's all the time we have to prove this is a proper family homestead. Mercy carefully refolded the telegram, her throat tight. What happens if we can't prove it? They'll take everything. Nolan's voice was heavy as he stoked the fire. The land, the cabin, all of it. Thunder rolled in the distance, making the window panes shudder. The storm that had been threatening all afternoon was finally moving in from the west. Mercy watched dark clouds gather over the valley below, matching her turbulent thoughts. "Where would we go?" she whispered. Nolan turned from the fireplace, his eyes meeting hers. "I won't let that happen," he said firmly. "I promise to protect you, and I mean to keep that promise." Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the cabin in harsh white light. The thunder that followed was closer now, rattling the dishes on their shelves. Outside, the wind picked up, driving the first heavy drops of rain against the roof. Mercy set aside her mending and gripped her cane, pushing herself carefully to her feet. Her twisted leg ached with the changing weather as she made her way across the room. Nolan watched her approach, his expression softening as it always did when she showed such determination. She stopped beside him at the fireplace, the flames casting flickering shadows across their faces. Her heart pounded as she gathered her courage. "If it keeps us safe," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the storm, "let's marry tonight." Nolan's eyes widened slightly. "Tonight? Who better to witness our vows than God himself?" She gestured to the storm raging outside. "We don't need a church building. The Bible says where 2 or 3 are gathered in his name, he is there." For a long moment, Nolan stood silent, searching her face. "Are you certain?" he finally asked. "This isn't how I wanted—" He paused, running a hand through his beard. "You deserve better than a hasty ceremony in a storm." Mercy reached out, touching his arm gently. "I deserve to feel safe. You've given me that. Let me help keep us both safe now." Another crash of thunder shook the cabin. Rain drummed steadily on the roof as Nolan crossed to the shelf where he kept his mother's Bible. The leather was worn smooth from years of handling, the pages soft at the edges. He set it carefully on the table, then lit a thick beeswax candle. The warm light helped push back the storm's darkness as Nolan opened the Bible to the Song of Solomon. His hands shook slightly as he turned the delicate pages. "Wait," Mercy said suddenly. She limped to her cot and returned with a small cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside was a length of faded blue ribbon, her mother's last gift before the fever took her. "Something old," she explained softly. "Like in the tradition." Nolan's throat tightened as he watched her tie the ribbon around her wrist. She smoothed her simple calico dress and pushed a stray curl behind her ear. Even in her plain clothes, with no fancy trimmings or bridal veil, she looked beautiful in the candlelight. They stood facing each other beside the fire, the Bible open between them as rain lashed the windows and thunder rolled overhead. Cooper sat alertly nearby, as if he too understood the significance of the moment. Nolan's voice was rough with emotion as he began. "I, Nolan Brand, take thee, Mercy Tilden." The traditional words felt new and powerful in the fire-lit cabin. Mercy's voice trembled but grew stronger as she repeated her own vows, promising to love, honor, and cherish. Lightning flashed as they spoke of better or worse, richer or poorer, in sickness and in health. When it came time to exchange rings, they had none to give. Instead, Nolan took Mercy's small hands in his calloused ones, his touch gentle and reverent. "What God has joined together," he said softly, "let no man put asunder." The thunder seemed to seal their words as Nolan leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a brief, chaste kiss. It was over in a moment, but Mercy felt it warm her entire being. When she opened her eyes, she saw tears glistening in Nolan's beard. They stood together by the fire as the storm raged on, neither speaking for a long while. The candle burned lower, wax dripping onto the table. Finally, Nolan slowly knelt before her, his head bowed. "You're my answered prayer," he whispered hoarsely. "All those nights I begged God for forgiveness, for purpose. He was leading me to you." Mercy's eyes filled with tears as she rested her hand on his bowed head. She remembered countless prayers of her own, asking for understanding of why she'd been born lame, why her parents had been taken, why her uncle saw her as a burden. Now she understood. God had been preparing her heart for this very moment. The storm gradually moved eastward, its fury spending itself against the mountains. Rain continued to fall steadily, but the thunder grew more distant. Neither Mercy nor Nolan slept that night. They sat together by the fire, sometimes talking softly, sometimes silent, their hands clasped as if afraid to let go. As false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Mercy dozed briefly against Nolan's shoulder. He remained still, watching her face in the dying firelight, memorizing every detail of this moment he'd never dared to hope for. The first true rays of sunrise broke through the clouds, painting the cabin walls in pale gold. Mercy stirred, blinking at the light. Silent tears tracked down her cheeks as she realized this was real. She was no longer alone, no longer unwanted. She was Mercy Brand now, and she was home. Cooper padded over and laid his head in her lap, his brown eyes wise and gentle. Outside, birds began their morning songs, and the fresh-washed world sparkled with raindrops. Inside the cabin, two souls who had found each other against all odds shared the quiet joy of their first sunrise as husband and wife. The Bible still lay open on the table, the blue ribbon beside it, and the remains of the candle that had witnessed their vows. These simple things had transformed their refuge into something more, a true home, sanctified by love and faith. Whatever challenges the railroad hearing might bring, they would face them together, their bond sealed before God and strengthened by trust in His providence. The mountain winter finally released its grip as March gave way to April. One morning, Mercy woke to find sunlight streaming through the cabin windows, bright and clear without the usual veil of clouds. She lay still for a moment, listening to the unfamiliar sound of bird song replacing the winter wind's howl. Outside, snow remained in patches under the pines, but bare earth showed through in widening circles around tree trunks and rocks. The air held the fresh scent of thaw, rich with the promise of growing things. Nolan had already gone out at dawn to check his trap lines one last time before the season ended. Mercy made her way to the door, leaning on her cane, and stepped onto the porch. The sun felt warm on her face as she watched a pair of mountain bluebirds flit between the branches, their wings flashing brilliant azure against the evergreens. "Reckon they're looking to nest," Nolan's voice came from around the corner of the cabin. He appeared carrying an armload of seed potatoes he'd been saving in the root cellar. "Good sign when the birds come back?" Mercy smiled, noting how the morning light softened his usually stern features. "The whole world feels new," she said softly. He set down the potatoes and pulled a small cloth packet from his coat pocket. "Brought you something from the trading post last week." Inside were various seed packets, carrots, beans, marigolds, and herbs. "Thought you might like a kitchen garden come summer." Her eyes brightened as she sorted through the packets. "I've never grown anything before," she admitted. "Uncle always said it wasn't worth the effort with my leg." "Your leg won't matter to the plants," Nolan said firmly. "They just need patience and care." He hesitated, then added quietly, "Like most living things." While Nolan began turning earth for the potato patch, Mercy gathered old clay pots she'd found in the lean-to. She arranged them along the sunny windowsill inside, filling each with rich black soil from near the creek. Her fingers trembled slightly with excitement as she pressed tiny seeds into the dirt. "My mother used to say a garden is an act of faith," she told Nolan when he came in for water. "You plant with hope, believing in what you cannot yet see." He paused, watching her carefully label each pot with paper markers. "Like marriage," he said softly, surprising them both with the observation. Mercy felt warmth bloom in her chest at his words. Though they'd been married nearly 3 weeks now, they were still learning to navigate their new relationship. Each day brought small discoveries about each other, moments of shared understanding that gradually bridged the space between them. Later that morning, as Mercy attempted to make biscuits, she accidentally knocked over the flour bin. White powder billowed across the plank floor like a miniature snowstorm. She froze, expecting anger. Her uncle had never tolerated such clumsiness. But to her amazement, Nolan began to laugh. It started as a low chuckle, then grew until his whole body shook with it. The sound was rusty, as if long unused, but genuine. Mercy couldn't help joining in, and soon they were both laughing harder than either had done in years. Cooper pranced through the flour, leaving paw prints everywhere, which only made them laugh more. "Lord above," Nolan finally managed, wiping his eyes. "I haven't laughed like that since." He trailed off, but the shadow that usually crossed his face when remembering the past seemed lighter somehow. Mercy touched his arm gently. "Maybe it's time we both remembered how." They cleaned up together, still chuckling occasionally at Cooper's powdered appearance. The dog seemed quite pleased with himself, having never seen his usually serious master so merry. The next day, Mercy found Nolan at the table, sketching on a piece of paper. He quickly tried to hide it when she approached, but she caught a glimpse of what looked like building plans. "What are you drawing?" she asked, curious. He hesitated before spreading out the rough sketch. "Been thinking about building a proper house," he said quietly. "Up on the ridge where the view's better. More room, better protected from slides." He glanced at her. "If you'd like that." Mercy studied the simple drawings: 2 bedrooms, a larger kitchen, a proper parlor. Her throat tightened as she realized what this meant. Nolan wasn't just planning for their immediate needs. He was looking toward a future together. "It's perfect," she whispered, tracing the lines with her finger. "Though I've grown fond of this cabin too." "We'll keep it for storage and such," he assured her. "But a wife deserves a proper home." His voice grew softer. "Our children will need room to grow." The word children hung in the air between them, full of tentative hope. Neither spoke further about it, but Mercy noticed Nolan added a small room to his plans later that evening. As April advanced, the days grew steadily warmer. Mercy's seedlings sprouted, tiny green shoots reaching for the sunlight. She tended them carefully, talking to them as she watered each morning. Sometimes she caught Nolan watching her with a gentle expression that made her heart flutter. One clear morning, Nolan suggested they ride into town together. Mercy hesitated. She hadn't been back since the night he'd brought her up the mountain. But spring had strengthened her leg, and she felt ready to face the townspeople who had once dismissed her as worthless. They took the wagon down the muddy trail, now mostly clear of snow. Mercy sat straight beside Nolan, determined to show no fear. As they approached Calico Ridge, she could see people stopping to stare. "We don't have to do this," Nolan said quietly. "Yes, we do," she replied. "I'm not ashamed anymore." He helped her down from the wagon, but she insisted on walking on her own, leaning on her beautifully carved cane. Her limp was still pronounced, but steadier now, thanks to daily exercise and proper rest. They made their way down Main Street together. The stares and whispers followed them, but Mercy held her head high. She noticed a few of the women watching with something like approval in their eyes. Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife, even gave her a small smile and nod. In the general store, Mercy selected some basic supplies while Nolan spoke with Mr. Jenkins about fencing materials. As she waited by the counter, she saw Nolan quietly ask the shopkeeper about fabric. Her heart warmed as she watched him examining different bolts of calico, finally selecting a lovely shade of blue that reminded her of the mountain bluebirds. He tried to hide the purchase, but she squeezed his hand to let him know she'd seen. The tender gesture meant more than the fabric itself. It showed he'd noticed her old dress was wearing thin, that he cared about her comfort and dignity. Their wagon was full as they started the journey home, not just with supplies but with a sense of accomplishment. They had faced the town together and emerged stronger. As they climbed back into the mountains, the late afternoon sun painted the peaks in gold. A cool breeze carried the scent of pine and new grass. Without planning it, Mercy began to sing softly. "Come, thou fount of every blessing, tune my heart to sing thy grace." To her delight, Nolan's deep voice joined in on the second line. The old hymn rose clear and true against the mountainside as their voices blended in harmony. Mercy didn't know Nolan could sing, and she watched him with wonder as they continued through all the verses. "Streams of mercy, never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise." The words held new meaning now. They spoke of grace and redemption, of divine love that could transform the darkest paths into roads of blessing. As their voices faded with the final Amen, Mercy felt tears on her cheeks. Not tears of sorrow this time, but of pure joy. The wagon creaked up the last steep stretch to their cabin. The evening light caught the new shoots of grass pushing through the soil, the buds swelling on tree branches, the first early wildflowers dotting the meadow. Everything spoke of renewal and hope. Cooper bounded out to greet them as they unloaded their purchases. Inside, Mercy's seedlings stretched toward the last rays of sun slanting through the windows. She touched their delicate leaves gently, marveling at how much growth could happen in such a short time. Later, as they sat by the fire, Nolan pulled out the blue calico. "Thought you might like a new dress," he said gruffly, obviously embarrassed by his own thoughtfulness. "For summer." Mercy ran her fingers over the soft fabric. "It's the exact color of those bluebirds," she said. "How did you know?" "Seen you watching them every morning," he admitted. "Noticed how your eyes light up when they come near." She leaned against his shoulder, breathing in his familiar scent of pine and leather. "Thank you," she whispered. "Not just for the fabric, for everything." His arm came around her carefully, and she felt him press a kiss to the top of her head. Outside, a pair of bluebirds trilled their evening song as darkness settled over the mountains. Inside the cabin, two hearts beat in quiet contentment, grateful for the peace they'd found in each other. The railroad hearing still loomed ahead, but for now, they allowed themselves to simply be happy. Their garden would grow, their new house would rise on the ridge, and their love would continue to deepen with each passing day. Like Mercy's seedlings reaching for the light, they were growing stronger together, their roots intertwining as they reached toward a future bright with promise. The April morning dawned clear and crisp, with mountain bluebirds darting between the newly leafed aspens. Mercy hummed as she hung freshly washed linens on the line, pausing occasionally to rest her leg. The past month had brought such peace to the cabin that sometimes she forgot about the railroad's pending claim. That peace shattered with the distant rumble of wagon wheels. Nolan emerged from the barn, his body tensing as he watched 3 wagons wind up the narrow mountain track. Dust billowed behind them, obscuring the valley below. He moved to stand beside Mercy, his hand finding hers. "Best get inside," he said quietly. "Put the coffee on." She nodded, understanding his unspoken message. They'd prepared for this day, knowing it would come. As she limped toward the cabin, she heard the wagons drawing closer, their wheels crunching over stone and spring grass. Through the window, Mercy watched a well-dressed man step down from the lead wagon. His suit looked out of place against the mountain backdrop, but his bearing suggested authority. 4 rough-looking men climbed down from the other wagons, carrying survey equipment and maps. "Mr. Brand," the suited man's voice carried clearly. "I'm Jasper Avery, representing the Western and Continental Railroad." Mercy's hands trembled slightly as she set out her best cups, the ones without chips. She heard Nolan's measured response through the open door. "What brings you up the mountain, Mr. Avery?" "Official business, I'm afraid. We need to inspect the property. There are some questions about your claim." Mercy moved to the doorway, steadying herself against the frame. Nolan stood straight-backed in the yard, his expression carefully neutral. "My papers are in order," he said. "Filed them proper with the county." Avery smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, we've seen those. Rather recent filing, wasn't it? Just this winter?" "The lady might offer coffee," Nolan said, changing the subject, "while we discuss your business." Mercy recognized her cue. She stepped fully onto the porch, forcing herself not to shrink from the stranger's curious stares. "Won't you gentlemen come in? The morning's still cool." Avery's eyebrows rose slightly at her proper speech, clearly not expecting such refinement in a mountain cabin. He removed his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Most kind, Mrs. Brand." Inside, Mercy poured coffee into her preserved cups, while the men settled around the table. She'd baked fresh bread that morning, and its homey scent filled the cabin. The surveyors remained standing, clutching their hats awkwardly, but Avery made himself comfortable. "Quite a domestic scene," he remarked, accepting his cup. "Though I understand you've only been married. What, 2 months?" "God's timing is his own," Mercy replied quietly, taking her place beside Nolan. Avery smiled that cold smile again. "Indeed. Though the timing does seem convenient, especially given the recent silver strike in these hills." "We didn't know about any silver when we married," Nolan said evenly. "No?" Avery sipped his coffee. "Well, that's not really my concern. My concern is the validity of your claim itself." He pulled out a folder of papers. "You see, there are some irregularities in your service record, Mr. Brand. Your discharge from the Army Scouts in '65 seems unclear." Mercy felt Nolan go still beside her. The silence stretched thick as honey. "I served honorably," Nolan finally said, his voice low. "Did you?" Avery's tone grew sharp. "Because our records suggest your last mission ended rather mysteriously. Something about a Ute engagement that went wrong? The government takes a dim view of questionable wartime service when considering land rights." Mercy's hand found Nolan's under the table. His fingers were cold. "You're reaching beyond your authority," Nolan said carefully. "Railroad men don't speak for the army." "Oh, but we do speak for progress, Mr. Brand, and progress requires certainty, clean titles, clear histories." Avery set down his cup with a decisive click. "The railroad needs this pass. If your claim proves complicated, well, the land would revert to government control, much simpler for everyone." The threat hung in the air like gun smoke. Mercy's throat tightened as she watched the surveyors exchanging knowing looks. This had been their plan all along, not just to claim the land, but to destroy Nolan's reputation in the process. "I think we're done here," Nolan said, rising slowly. Avery stood as well, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve. "For now, but we'll need to investigate further. That war record of yours, well, memories have a way of surfacing, don't they? Especially Ute memories." He gestured to his men, who filed out quickly. At the door, Avery paused. "Lovely coffee, Mrs. Brand. Shame if you had to leave such a comfortable situation." The wagon's departure seemed to take forever. Mercy and Nolan stood in silence until the last trace of dust settled on the trail. Then she turned to him, her heart aching at the shadows in his eyes. "What did he mean?" she asked softly. "About the Utes?" Nolan moved to the window, staring out at the mountains as if seeing something far beyond their peaks. His shoulders carried the weight of years of unspoken burden. "I led scouts against them," he finally said, "in '65, but it wasn't like he thinks." His voice grew rough with memory. "They didn't fight us. They saved me." Mercy waited, knowing he needed to find the words in his own time. The cabin creaked gently in the warming day, and somewhere outside, Cooper whined at the lingering scent of strangers. "We were supposed to clear the valley," Nolan continued, "remove any Ute camps we found. But when we reached their winter grounds..." He shook his head. "There were only women, children, and elders. The men were away hunting. My commander wanted to drive them out anyway, into the snow." His hands gripped the windowsill. "I couldn't do it. Wouldn't. There was a baby, not more than a few months old. Reminded me of my sister's child who died that winter." He drew a shuddering breath. "I turned my rifle on my own men, told the Utes to run while I held them off." Mercy moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his arm. "What happened?" "Chaos. Shooting. I took a bullet in the shoulder. Would have died in the snow, but the Utes came back for me. Their medicine woman tended me for 2 months in a hidden cave." His voice grew softer. "They could have left me. Should have. But they showed mercy I didn't deserve." "That's why you left the army?" He nodded. "Couldn't face a court-martial. Couldn't let them twist what happened. So I disappeared into the mountains. Been carrying that guilt ever since." Mercy's heart ached for the weight he'd carried alone all these years. "You chose mercy over orders," she said quietly. "That's nothing to feel guilty about. Tell that to the railroad men who'll paint me as a deserter, or worse, a traitor. Then we'll tell the truth, all of it." She turned him gently to face her. "God knows what happened. He'll help us prove it." Nolan's eyes met hers, full of a desperate need to believe. "How can you be so sure?" "Because he brought me to you," she said simply, "and I don't believe that was just chance." The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. Taking her hand, he led her to their bedroom, where they kept their family Bible. Together they knelt beside the bed as the afternoon light streamed through the window. Mercy's voice rose clear and strong. "Dear Lord, you know all hearts and all histories. You know the truth of what happened that day, and why. Please help us bring that truth to light before others can twist it for their own purposes." "Amen," Nolan whispered, his voice rough with emotion. They remained kneeling together, hands clasped, as the sun slowly tracked across the cabin floor. The mountain winds whispered through the aspens outside, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried, free and unafraid against the endless Colorado sky. In that moment of shared prayer, Mercy felt their bond deepen beyond mere marriage of convenience or even growing love. They were now truly partners, united against those who would try to destroy their home, and peace with half-truths and threats. The railroad men's wagons had left deep ruts in the spring earth, marks that would take time to heal. But as Mercy and Nolan rose from their prayers, they both knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, with truth, faith, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing you've chosen the right path, no matter how difficult. The county courthouse loomed before them, its red brick facade stern against the morning sky. Mercy gripped Nolan's arm as they climbed the worn steps, her wooden cane tapping against stone. The hearing room already buzzed with whispers when they entered. Judge Harrison sat behind his massive oak desk, while Mr. Avery stood near the windows, shuffling papers with practiced confidence. Townsfolk filled the wooden benches, their curious eyes following Nolan and Mercy as they made their way to the front. "This hearing concerns the land claim of Nolan Brand," Judge Harrison announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Mr. Avery, you may present your evidence." Avery stepped forward, his boots clicking on the floorboards. "Your Honor, the Western and Continental Railroad challenges Mr. Brand's right to his homestead based on questions about his military service." He reached into his leather portfolio. "I present as evidence this photograph, taken in 1865. The sepia image passed to the judge showed younger men in Union uniforms. Mercy's breath caught as she recognized Nolan among them, beardless but with the same steady eyes. "This unit," Avery continued, his voice carrying to the back of the room, "was responsible for the Rock Creek Massacre. 37 Ute people killed, including women and children." He pointed to Nolan in the photograph. "And there stands their commander." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mercy felt Nolan stiffen beside her, his jaw clenched tight. "That's a lie," Mercy said, her voice stronger than she felt. She struggled to her feet, ignoring the pain in her leg. "My husband wasn't the commander that day. He was there, yes, but he—" "Mrs. Brand?" Avery interrupted smoothly. "Were you present at Rock Creek?" "No, but I know." "Then you can't speak to what happened there, can you?" "I can speak to what I know is true," Mercy insisted. The room fell silent as she continued. "My husband carried wounded Ute children from that battlefield. He protected them from slaughter, not led it." Judge Harrison leaned forward. "That's a serious claim, Mrs. Brand. Do you have proof?" "The Ute people themselves can verify it," she said. "They saved his life after he was shot protecting them." Avery's smile turned cold. "Shot by whom, Mrs. Brand? His own men, perhaps, after he turned traitor?" "Order," Judge Harrison commanded, as the crowd's whispers grew louder. "These are grave accusations that require thorough investigation." He shuffled through the papers before him. "I'm delaying judgment for 30 days while we verify these claims." Court dismissed. The ride home stretched endless and silent. Spring winds whipped across the ridge as their wagon creaked up the familiar trail. Near the cabin, Mercy's world suddenly tilted sideways, darkness creeping at the edges of her vision. "Nolan," she whispered, then felt herself falling. Strong arms caught her before she hit the wagon bed. Through a haze, she felt Nolan lift her, cradling her against his chest as he carried her inside. His touch was gentle as he laid her on their bed, but she caught the trembling in his hands as he covered her with a quilt. "Rest," he said roughly. "You've worn yourself out defending a man who doesn't deserve it." She tried to reach for him, but exhaustion pulled her under. When she woke hours later, the cabin was dark and empty except for Cooper whining at the door. Outside, stars wheeled above the mountains in their ancient dance. Nolan sat alone by the cold fire pit, his face turned toward heaven. His whispered words carried on the night air. "Lord, I don't deserve mercy. Not after what happened. Not after I couldn't save them all." His voice broke. "But please, protect her. She believed in me when no one else would. Don't let my past destroy her future." Mercy watched through the window as her husband wrestled with his demons under the vast Colorado sky. She ached to go to him, to share his burden, but understood his need to face these memories alone. So she did what she could. She prayed, adding her quiet petitions to his, asking God to heal what war and guilt had broken in this good man's heart. The night deepened. Coyotes called in the distance. And still Nolan kept his vigil, seeking forgiveness from the stars that had witnessed it all, searching for mercy he couldn't yet grant himself. Dawn painted the mountain peaks in pale gold when hoofbeats echoed up the trail. Nolan stood in the cabin doorway, Cooper alert at his side, as a wagon appeared through the morning mist. Preacher Tilden sat rigid on the bench, flanked by two stern-faced deacons. "We've come for mercy," the preacher announced, his voice brittle with authority. "This is no place for her now with all that's come to light." Mercy appeared behind Nolan, her face drawn from sleepless nights. The preacher's words struck deep into her confused heart. Perhaps if she left, the railroad men would leave Nolan in peace. Perhaps distance would protect him from further scandal. "Uncle," she said softly, "I'll come." She felt Nolan tense beside her. "Mercy, no." Nolan's voice was rough with emotion. "You don't have to go." But she saw the shadows haunting his eyes, the way guilt bent his shoulders. He blamed himself for bringing trouble to her door. Her heart ached, knowing he thought himself unworthy of defending. "It's all right," she whispered, touching his arm. "Just for now." The deacons helped her into the wagon, while Nolan stood motionless, his face carved from stone. Only his eyes betrayed his pain as he watched them turn the wagon around. Cold sleet began to fall, needles of ice stinging exposed skin. Nolan remained in the yard long after the wagon disappeared, his broad shoulders dusted white. Cooper pressed against his leg, whining softly at his master's distress. In town, the parsonage walls felt like a prison to Mercy. She sat, in her old room, listening to whispered conversations drift up from below. "A butcher, that's what he was," someone said. "Leading those soldiers against innocent people." Mercy's hands trembled as she gripped her mother's worn Bible. She refused the meals her uncle sent up, spending hours on her knees instead. "Lord," she prayed in the candlelight, "show them the truth about Nolan's heart." Days crawled past like molasses in winter. With each sunset, Mercy's resolve grew stronger. She knew now that leaving hadn't protected anyone. It had only left them both bleeding inside. Whatever storms lay ahead, they needed to face them together. Nolan wandered deep into the timber, leaving the cabin to echo with emptiness. Cooper had refused to stay behind, padding silently beside him through pristine snow. For 3 days, they pushed higher into the mountains where only deer trails marked the way. He survived on dried jerky from his saddlebag, drinking from icy streams that cut through the rocks. At night, huddled under a lean-to of pine boughs, memories flooded back. memories he'd tried to bury beneath years of solitude. The Ute scouts had found him half frozen in a ravine, deserting after the massacre. Instead of killing him, they had wrapped him in buffalo robes and called him Brother Wolf for his lonely ways. They had shown him mercy when he deserved none. His hands trembled as he remembered the young Ute boy, no more than 12, who had taught him their words for the stars. Later, when fever took the child, Nolan had dug the grave himself, marking it with river stones while the boy's father sang to the dawn. "I didn't lead the killing," he whispered to the darkness, "but I didn't stop it either." On the 4th morning, as pale sunlight filtered through the pines, clarity struck him like lightning. Running solved nothing. If he truly sought redemption, he had to face judgment, not hide from it like a coward. Finding a tall pine, Nolan drew his knife and carved a rough cross deep into the bark. He knelt in the snow, his first true prayer in years spilling from cracked lips. "Lord, I don't deserve forgiveness, but if you're listening, help me make things right." Meanwhile, in town, Mercy moved with quiet purpose. She had spent days planning, gathering supplies when her uncle wasn't watching. Into a cloth sack went dried apples, cornbread, and jerky from the general store. She borrowed a steady mare from the livery stable, leaving a note promising return. In the gray hours before dawn, Mercy mounted awkwardly, her twisted leg protesting. But determination burned in her chest as she turned the horse's head toward the ridge. She knew the path to Nolan's cabin by heart, every turn, every creek crossing. The snow had started falling again, but she urged the mare forward. Some journeys demanded courage, and this one was hers to make. The wind howled through the pines, driving sheets of snow before it. Nolan huddled deeper into his coat, lost in dark thoughts of redemption and loss. Cooper whined and pressed close against his leg as the temperature plummeted. Then, carried on the howling wind, came something impossible. A woman's voice, trembling but clear, singing the familiar words, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound." Nolan's head snapped up. "Mercy," he whispered, hardly daring to believe. The voice came again, weaker now, nearly lost in the growing storm. He plunged through deepening drifts, Cooper bounding ahead. There, a dark shape against the white. Mercy slumped half-frozen against her horse's flank, her lips blue but still forming the hymn's words. "Lord have mercy," Nolan breathed, gathering her cold form in his arms. Her eyelids fluttered as she whispered his name. Through the curtain of white, he spotted the old trapper's cabin, just a simple log structure, but shelter from the killing cold. Kicking the door open, he carried her inside while Cooper herded the horse around to the lean-to. His hands shook as he built a fire, feeding precious dry tinder and kindling until flames caught. He wrapped Mercy in his heavy coat, rubbing her cold hands between his own. "What were you thinking, riding up here in a storm?" he asked softly, his voice rough with emotion. Her eyes opened, bright with fever but clear. "They called me useless," she whispered, "all my life, but God had a purpose even for me." She squeezed his hand weakly. "He used me to claim a man the world forgot." Tears froze on Nolan's beard as the truth of her words struck him. All these years he'd thought himself beyond redemption. But God had sent this gentle soul to prove him wrong. Through the long night, as the blizzard raged outside, he held her hand and watched her sleep. He prayed openly for the first time since the war, giving thanks for this miracle of grace. When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed. Sunlight sparkled on fresh snow as pure and clean as newfound faith. Mercy's fever had broken too. She smiled up at him, and in that smile he saw his future, one washed clean of guilt and filled with promise. As morning light pierced the clouds, hoofbeats echoed across the snow-laden valley. The preacher led a group of riders, including Avery and 2 marshals, following Mercy's trail to the trapper's cabin. Mercy stood in the doorway, her shoulders straight despite her limp. "Uncle," she called out, her voice carrying across the crisp air, "you lied about the reports." Under the weight of the marshal's stern gazes, the preacher's proud facade crumbled. His confession spilled forth like spring thaw. He had forged wartime testimonies, trying to hide his theft of army supply contracts during the war. The marshals moved swiftly, binding his wrists as Mercy reached into her coat pocket. She withdrew a worn piece of paper Nolan had once shown her, a treaty clause granting land rights to settlers who had sheltered surviving Ute scouts. Avery's face fell as he read the document. The railroad man removed his hat, conceding defeat with a curt nod. The judge, who had ridden up with them, signed the confirmation of Nolan's claim right there on his saddle horn. Townspeople who had followed hung their heads, shame evident in their downcast eyes. Nolan and Mercy stood together in the morning light, their joined hands a testament to faith vindicated. Above them, sunlight painted the mountain peaks in hues of gold, as bright as truth revealed. Weeks melted into spring like snow into streams. The mountain air carried the sweet scent of wild roses and fresh pine. Around the cabin, life bloomed with renewed purpose. Mercy knelt in her garden, her fingers working rich soil around tender seedlings. Rows of carrots and peas stretched toward the sun, while herbs flourished in clay pots along the fence. She hummed softly, pausing now and then to rest her hand on her growing belly. Above her, Nolan moved carefully across the roof, replacing worn shingles. The steady rhythm of his hammer echoed down the ridge. Cooper dozed in the cabin doorway, his tail thumping whenever children's laughter drifted up from the yard. Every Wednesday, a small group of Ute children gathered at the cabin. They sat cross-legged on the porch while Mercy taught them letters from worn primers. Nolan showed them how to carve simple animals from pine, their small hands growing steady with practice. As sunset painted the sky in amber and rose, Mercy and Nolan sat down to their evening meal. Steam rose from bowls of beans, and fresh bread filled the cabin with its homey scent. Their quiet laughter mingled with the evening bird's song. Mercy touched her swelling belly, wonder in her eyes. Nolan reached across the table and whispered, "Thank you, Lord," his voice thick with gratitude. Together they lit the evening lamp, its warm glow spilling through the windows and across the valley below. Night settled gentle as a prayer around their mountain home. From the town below, church bells rang clear and sweet through the evening air. Mercy leaned against Nolan's shoulder, peace in every breath. "God didn't forget us," she said softly. Nolan's arm tightened around her as he replied, "He never does." Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.